You didn't just witness a routine palace update. You watched a system reach its absolute breaking point. In a twist that has shattered the long-held illusion of royal unity, a king was left standing side by side with his heir, finally admitting that the bond he tried to protect has been fractured beyond repair. This wasn't just about a family disagreement. It was about secrecy, control, and what happens when the emotional center of a monarchy begins to slip away. Behind the gilded walls of Windsor, the palace dropped its guard, revealing a crisis of trust that no amount of polished PR could hide. It began with whispers and subtle tremors inside the palace that something was fundamentally wrong. Staffers noticed a quiet, heavy tension behind closed doors, and most telling of all, the sudden, unexplained cancellation of engagements that hinted at a deeper, more explosive reality. Sources reveal that King Charles, in a moment of raw vulnerability, sat alone in a room where even his most trusted advisors were forbidden. Before him lay a letter, not a statement crafted by the palace machine, but a personal reckoning with his youngest son, Harry. The words, reportedly scrolled in the king's own hand, were raw and defeated, allegedly asking, "Was it ever love, or was I just a throne?" As the scandal intensified, Princess Anne emerged not as a passive bystander, but as the monarchy's critical voice of reason. Known for her discipline and skepticism, she saw the circus that the public narrative was becoming and decided to intervene. In a direct confrontation behind closed doors at Sandringham, and didn't plead, she delivered a surgical warning that silenced the room. She told her brother clearly that while he might be a father, he is first a king, and that the crown would not survive this level of public cannibalization. Her message was sharp. "There is still time for dignity," she reportedly said, urging Charles to choose the survival of the institution over the emotional turmoil of a broken relationship. The deeper the auditors looked into the royal accounts, the more they realized this wasn't just about emotional betrayal. It was about institutional treason. Anne's instincts were tragically accurate, uncovering a paper trail that suggested a shadow influence was being established right under the king's nose. There were red flags in the royal funds and unauthorized communications that bypassed both tradition and trust. Charles was reportedly blindsided to realize that while he believed they operated as one, a parallel campaign was being run to reshape the royal power structure. The palace's silence, once a hallmark of royal strength, now signaled paralysis as the legal war machine began to turn. But what was meant to be a private reckoning erupted into the public domain the moment the truth became too heavy to hide. Charles stood alone, realizing that every non-response from his spokespeople only deepened public suspicion. But why did he decide to stop the letters? What did he see in that secret dossier that terrified him more than the bad headlines? The answers lie in the evidence still sealed in the court's archive, waiting for the moment the next mask slips. The silence following Charles's withdrawal wasn't a sign of peace, but a heavy, suffocating paralysis that gripped every corridor of Buckingham Palace. As the king retreated into the shadows of Sandringham, the legal dossier he left behind began to circulate among the few people he still trusted. This wasn't just a list of financial discrepancies. It was a map of a broken family and a crumbling institution. Inside those pages was the final proof that the rejection of Harry was no longer just a personal choice, but a constitutional necessity forced by years of calculated deception. Prince William, the man destined to inherit this fractured legacy, reportedly stood in the center of the storm, his reaction described as cold, controlled, but unmistakably wounded. For William, the lawsuit and the unsent letter represented the ultimate failure of the family-first ideal he had fought to uphold. He wasn't just an heir watching a drama. He was a man watching the very mechanism of royal accountability being dismantled from within. Sources say he slammed a folder onto the table in a heated exchange, demanding to know how a parallel power structure could have been built without his knowledge. The contents of the Cornwall Fund documents were the most damning of all, revealing a secret financial channel meant to operate independently of the Duchy of Cornwall. It suggested that the betrayal Charles felt wasn't limited to a single person, but extended to a network of quiet consent among high-ranking courtiers who chose to stay silent. Charles realized with a heavy heart that his youngest son's exile had been used as a distraction while a more dangerous game of influence was being played inside his own home. This was the realization that reportedly broke his resolve to keep the family together. Across the Atlantic, the silence from Harry remained absolute, yet the weight of it was felt in every room of the palace. Harry had reportedly reached out to intermediaries, sensing the crisis from afar, but the door that was once slightly ajar had been slammed shut by the revelations in the audit. The letter Charles never sent contained the apology he wanted to give, but the evidence of institutional treason made that apology an impossibility. To forgive Harry now was seen by the establishment as a sign of weakness that the crown could no longer afford. Princess Anne, ever the protector of the old codes, watched the fracturing with a grim sense of alarm. She had always moved within the boundaries of tradition, and seeing them obliterated by ambition was her greatest fear realized. She pushed for the Privy Council to step in, knowing that the family alone could no longer heal itself. The battle was no longer just between a father and a son, or a king and a consort. It was a battle for the soul of the British monarchy itself. But as the world waited for the next public statement, a new leak began to emerge, one that suggested the unsent letter had been intercepted before Charles could ever destroy it. And the person holding that letter wasn't a friend of the crown. The leverage was shifting, and for Harry, the rejection was about to become more public and more painful than he ever imagined. Behind the heavy oak doors of the king's private study, the air was thick with a truth that no one was supposed to see. When Charles finally opened the secret dossier prepared by royal auditors, the weight of the evidence reportedly left him breathless and physically shaken. This wasn't just about administrative errors or mismanaged accounts. It was a map of a calculated, high-stakes deception that had been operating in the shadows for over a year. The king had demanded answers for months, hoping for a simple explanation. But the reality he uncovered was far darker and more personal than he could have ever imagined. The file contained transcripts of private emails and late-night phone records between the Queen Consort and high-level political donors. These weren't just social calls. The communications suggested a coordinated effort to reshape the monarchy's influence within Parliament, bypassing the king's authority entirely. Charles realized that his wife wasn't merely overstepping her role. She was carving out her own sovereign base of power. The revelation suggested that while he was battling illness and family strife, a shadow influence was being built right under his roof. The most devastating piece of evidence was the Cornwall Fund initiative, a financial channel independent from the Crown estate, designed to be controlled solely by Camilla's inner circle. This project, complete with its own branding and private trust partners, proved that the betrayal was not an impulsive mistake but a strategic maneuver executed in silence. It was a calculated attempt to secure a legacy that didn't depend on Charles, a move that the king saw as institutional treason. He was no longer just a monarch under fire. He was a man who felt his life's work was being hijacked. In the same folder, aides reportedly found a torn, crumpled letter in Charles's own handwriting, a message written in the dead of night that he never had the heart to send. The words were raw and filled with a profound sense of defeat, allegedly asking, "Was it ever love, or was I just a throne?" This letter, now part of the confidential court annex, revealed a heartbreak that went deeper than any political scandal. The king wasn't just fighting for the crown anymore. He was reckoning with the collapse of the marriage he had sacrificed everything to defend. The atmosphere inside the palace became even more unsettled when 3 senior staff members from Clarence House abruptly resigned just weeks before the legal filing. No public reasons were given, but whispers suggest these exits were strategic attempts to distance themselves from the looming fallout. One staffer, a personal aide to Camilla for over a decade, is now rumored to be preparing testimony that could provide the final, devastating blow should the case reach open court. Her knowledge of the secret communications and hidden motives could shatter the remaining credibility of the Queen Consort's camp. Perhaps most disturbing were the documents hinting at backdoor efforts to alter discussions about the royal succession. The dossier suggested that Camilla had inquired about alternative models of shared regency, positions that would make her a permanent fixture of power even if Charles became unable to rule. The timing of these conversations, occurring just before the king's recent health evaluations, raised alarms throughout the royal household. It painted a portrait of a partner who wasn't just preparing for a future, but was actively trying to control it at any cost. As the investigation probed deeper, a haunting question began to emerge. Who else knew? For a system that prides itself on obsessive attention to detail, the gaps in oversight weren't just suspicious. They were damning. Whispers inside the palace suggest that high-ranking officials may have been aware of financial irregularities for months, but chose to stay silent. The silence surrounding the scandal hinted at a network of quiet consent, raising the terrifying possibility that the betrayal was not a one-woman operation, but a systemic failure. For William, the lawsuit against Camilla is not just a political storm. It is a personal crucible. Behind palace doors, his reaction has been described as cold, controlled, but unmistakably wounded. Those closest to him say he expected press scandals and family rifts, but not a courtroom battle between his father and stepmother with the monarchy's integrity hanging in the balance. Certainly not while his own children, heirs to the very legacy now under fire, watch from the sidelines, vulnerable and confused. William, for all his composed public appearances, has reportedly reached a breaking point, no longer a passive heir but a man watching his inheritance collapse from within. Harry, miles away yet never truly disconnected, reportedly offered to fly in for a private meeting despite years of tension. Something in this specific crisis pulled at him, whether out of duty, guilt, or a buried sense of loyalty. Sources claim Harry reached out to intermediaries in London, expressing concern for his father's mental and emotional state. But that olive branch may have come too late or perhaps not at all. Charles, in one of his rarest gestures, left Harry a private voice message, one that insiders say still hasn't been returned, leaving the father and son in a haunting silence. While the public watches every move of the royal men, Camilla herself is preparing a counteroffensive that could bring down more than just Charles. She has been silent, but not idle. Sources now claim she's assembling her own legal team, media allies, and insiders willing to expose Charles's past decisions to the world. This isn't just a divorce or a lawsuit. It's shaping up to be a total royal war. What began as a defensive posture has now evolved into a calculated and defiant offensive aimed at the king's credibility. Camilla, once portrayed as the restrained consort, is reportedly gathering an arsenal of documentation that could tarnish the institution itself. Confidential documents detailing Charles's past private expenditures have already found their way to select journalists. Among them are unaccounted luxury renovations, secret travel arrangements, and payments flagged by internal audits, but buried before they could spark scrutiny. More troubling, whispers suggest that even confidential health records may be leveraged to paint a portrait of a monarch not in full command of his faculties. Her legal team is quietly drafting witness lists that include former palace employees, people who worked closely with Charles during his transition to the throne. Some are said to be willing to testify about private confrontations and behind-the-scenes disputes that could support Camilla's claim that this lawsuit is about power rather than betrayal. Camilla believes she's earned her place and weathered storms that would have broken any other royal figure. Her reported response to close friends was cold and clear. "He crowned me. He can't uncrown me." It's a bold declaration that signals this is no longer about reconciliation. It's about survival. With the palace machinery turning against her, she's choosing war over surrender. PR strategies are being sharpened as Camilla acts like a queen in exile, preparing to take the throne of public opinion by force. Her defiance has left the monarchy teetering, and for the first time, even Charles's most loyal allies are questioning how far this will go and whether anyone will be left standing once it's over. The conspiracy within the palace deepens as investigators find that the Lord Chamberlain himself may have been aware of financial irregularities months before Charles saw the dossier. Internal records from the Duchy of Cornwall only added fuel to the fire, with audits vanishing and files mysteriously lost. It was as if a silent hand had moved through the palace, erasing the fingerprints of a conspiracy no one dared speak of. The question now haunting the monarchy is simple: who chose to stay quiet, and why? As the legal war between King Charles and Queen Camilla reached a fever pitch, Princess Anne decided that she could no longer remain a silent witness to the monarchy's self-destruction. In a rare break from her legendary stoicism, She stepped into the center of the chaos, not as a sister, but as the institution's last unbroken moral compass. Behind the closed doors of Sandringham, she reportedly delivered a message that was more surgical than emotional, demanding an immediate reckoning. She made it clear to her brother that if this family feud was allowed to reach a public courtroom, she would walk away from every royal duty she had ever sworn to uphold. Anne's ultimatum wasn't a plea for peace. It was a command for structure in a house that had lost its foundation. She told Charles directly that while the family had survived global wars, it would not survive the rhapsodic circus of a public trial. She demanded an emergency session of the Privy Council, a move that would bypass the media storm and move the battle into a closed-door royal tribunal. It was the only way to restore order without inviting further public ruin, and surprisingly, Prince William stood firmly behind her, viewing his aunt as the only person left who wasn't chasing a personal agenda. Outside the palace walls, the public sentiment was beginning to shift in a way that terrified the inner circle. New polls showed a dramatic surge in support for Princess and, with many calling her the only stabilizing force left within the crown. Some even began floating the once unthinkable idea of Anne as an emergency regent, should Charles become unable to fulfill his duties. This groundswell of public loyalty to Anne was a direct rebuke to the drama surrounding Charles and Camilla, painting her as the last principled royal standing between tradition and total implosion. The idea of and gaining constitutional power did not sit well with the queen consort. Camilla, already seething from the revelations in the audit, was reportedly livid at the prospect of being sidelined by her sister-in-law. According to leaked messages, she dismissed Anne's intervention as the interference of an unelected regent, a phrase that quickly sparked a firestorm on social media. To Anne's supporters, this was final proof that Camilla never truly understood the soul of the monarchy, viewing it only as a struggle for survival rather than a commitment to duty. As the tension between the two women escalated, Charles found himself increasingly isolated, cornered by his wife's legal threats and his sister's moral demands. He realized that the letter he never sent to Harry was just a small part of a much larger tragedy. The monarchy was cannibalizing itself in real time, and the very mechanisms of royal accountability were being used as weapons. The king knew he had to make a move that no one, not even Anne or William, could have predicted. In the eerie calm of his study, Charles began to prepare for an unannounced address to the nation. He pushed aside the legal dossiers and the scripts written by his PR team, choosing instead to speak from a place of raw, haunting clarity. He knew that once he spoke, the crown as the world knew it would be changed forever. The power vacuum was becoming too dangerous, and the silence from Harry across the ocean was a reminder of everything he had already lost. But as the cameras were being set up for his historic broadcast, a final piece of evidence from the audit was brought to his attention, something that linked the betrayal not just to the present, but to the final wishes of Queen Elizabeth herself. It was a revelation that would turn his heartbreak into a cold, decisive fury. The atmosphere in the small, temporary broadcasting room at Sandringham was thick with a silence that felt heavy enough to shatter. Technicians moved like ghosts, aware that they were about to witness a moment that would rewrite centuries of royal protocol. There were no teleprompters, no glossy PR handlers, and no pre-approved talking points. Just a king, visibly drained and haunted, sitting before a single camera, preparing to tell the world that the fairy tale was over. But moments before the on-air light flickered red, a final, devastating revelation had reached the king's desk. A message from Queen Elizabeth's former secretary that turned his heartbreak into a cold, decisive fury. The secretary had revealed the existence of a sealed codicil to the late queen's final wishes, one that appeared to have been amended under questionable persuasion. Charles realized with a jolt of horror that the betrayal hadn't started with the Cornwall Fund. It had begun while his mother was still drawing her final breaths. The audit trail suggested that Camilla had been reshaping the Queen's final wishes long before Charles even ascended the throne. To Charles, this wasn't just a financial discrepancy or a power grab. It was the desecration of his mother's legacy. It was the ultimate institutional treason that made the unsent letter to Harry look like a distant minor grief. This discovery was the final thread that snapped, leaving the king with no choice but to burn the bridge he had spent a lifetime building. When the broadcast finally aired, catching even senior palace officials off guard, the nation was stunned into a collective gasp. Charles began by announcing he would be stepping back from public duties indefinitely. The words indefinitely fell like a thunderclap across the country, signaling a soft abdication that no one had predicted. But it was what he didn't say that carried the most weight. Throughout the entire address, Charles made no mention of Camilla. Not a single word, not a phrase of acknowledgement for the woman who was supposed to be his queen consort. The omission was surgical, a public erasure that told the world their partnership was permanently broken. He turned his focus instead to the Privy Council and those who had demonstrated unwavering integrity. A clear nod to Princess and the sister who had stood as his final moral compass. He announced that all legal proceedings concerning the royal household were to be paused, moved into a private review conducted away from the courts and the cameras. This was Charles's strategic retreat, a final attempt to halt the monarchy's bleeding before it collapsed under the weight of its own secrets. He was moving the circus into the shadows, hoping that dignity could still be salvaged in the darkness. The most haunting moment came at the very end, when Charles looked directly into the lens and delivered a line that will be dissected for decades. When the truth came for me, I stood alone. It was a confession of a man who realized that in his quest to protect the crown, he had lost everyone he ever loved. It was a lament for a broken marriage and a distant son, and a warning that the institution he was leaving behind was built on fragile trust. As the screen went black, a terrifying uncertainty began to fill the vacuum. The courtroom might have fallen silent, but behind the palace doors, the real battle for Britain's crown was only just beginning. Camilla's reaction to the broadcast was not one of defeat, but of a queen preparing for the final, most destructive chapter of this royal war. The world stood still the moment the broadcast ended, leaving the nation to grapple with the haunting reality of a soft abdication. Charles had effectively disappeared into the shadows, but the surgical omission of Queen Camilla from his address spoke louder than any legal filing ever could. It was a public erasure, a declaration that the woman who had fought for decades to be accepted was no longer a part of the king's future. But inside Clarence House, the silence wasn't one of defeat. It was the cold, calculated preparation for a royal war. Camilla's camp, far from retreating, began assembling an arsenal of documentation that threatened to burn down the entire institution. Sources claim she had already authorized the leak of Charles's past private expenditures, from luxury renovations to secret travel arrangements, aimed at stripping him of his moral authority. Her response to the king's retreat was one of pure defiance. He crowned me. He can't uncrown me. She was no longer just the queen consort. She was a queen in exile, preparing to strike back with evidence that suggested the king was not in full command of his faculties when key decisions were made. As the Privy Council moved in to assume temporary oversight, Princess Anne emerged as the improbable pillar holding the crown together. Her urgent plea for dignity had resonated with a public that saw her as the monarchy's last unbroken moral compass. Yet, even as she worked to mediate the chaos, the unelected regent narrative spread by Camilla's allies threatened to undermine her every move, and knew that the private review Charles had called for was a fragile truce, one that could be shattered by a single leaked email or a rogue testimony from a former staffer. Prince William, caught in the middle of this titanic struggle, found himself looking at the wreckage of his inheritance. He realized that the conspiracy of silence that had allowed the shadow influence to flourish was now his burden to dismantle. For William, the lawsuit wasn't just about betrayal. It was a personal crucible that forced him to watch his father's mental state crumble while his stepmother prepared to launch a final, destructive offensive. He wasn't just an heir anymore. He was a man witnessing the total implosion of the trust he was meant to defend. Meanwhile, the letter Charles never sent remained a ticking time bomb in the court's evidence archive. It was a testament to the king's original sin, choosing the machine over his own son. As Harry watched from across the Atlantic, the realization that his father had stood alone when the truth finally arrived was a bitter pill to swallow. The monarchy was cannibalizing itself in real time, and the world was beginning to wonder if there would be anything left to inherit once the dust finally settled. The fragile truce established by Charles's withdrawal lasted less than 48 hours before the first devastating leak hit the front pages, proving that the royal war was now in a scorched earth phase. Camilla's legal battalion, realizing the king had effectively erased her from the national narrative, moved to release a series of internal memos that painted a terrifying picture of life behind the gilded doors. These documents didn't just focus on money. They targeted the king's emotional stability, suggesting that the letter he never sent to Harry was not an act of a grieving father, but a symptom of a monarch who had lost his grip on reality. The public was suddenly thrust into a debate they were never meant to have. Was the king's silence a sign of dignity or a sign of collapse? As the hashtag Team Camilla began to trend alongside Save the Crown, the institutional siege reached the very heart of the royal household. Prince William, who had been trying to maintain a facade of calm, reportedly felt the floor falling out from under him as he realized his father's most private moments of heartbreak were being used as legal leverage. He saw the legacy of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, being dismantled day by day, replaced by a media firestorm that no one could contain. The most chilling revelation in this phase was the discovery of witness lists being prepared by Camilla's camp, which included former aides who had witnessed the king's private confrontations with his sons. These staffers were allegedly prepared to testify about erratic behavior and unilateral decisions that bypassed traditional palace protocol. It was a move designed to force the king into a corner. If he proceeded with the legal review of the Cornwall Fund, Camilla would proceed with a public trial that would expose every hidden wound of the House of Windsor. While Charles remained isolated at Sandringham, his physical appearance in the few telephoto lens shots that leaked showed a man who had aged a decade in weeks. The signs of stress that the public could see, the deepened lines on his face, the trembling of his hands during the broadcast, were now being reinterpreted through the lens of Camilla's counternarrative. She was effectively using the king's own vulnerability against him, arguing that a man so broken could not be trusted to manage the royal accounts, let alone the future of the monarchy. Princess, and watching the circus she had warned about escalate into a national crisis, made a final, desperate move to protect the heirs. She reportedly ordered a security blackout on all internal communications, realizing that the betrayal wasn't just coming from the top, but from a network of courtiers who were hedging their bets on who would survive the fallout. For Anne, the survival of the crown was now a matter of surgical intervention, and she was prepared to cut out any part of the family that threatened the whole. But the one factor no one could control was Harry. Across the Atlantic, the Duke of Sussex was being presented with a choice: remain a bystander to the destruction of his father, or become the ultimate witness in a trial that would settle the score once and for all. The letter Charles never sent had become the most valuable piece of paper in the world, and everyone was waiting to see who would be the first to sell its soul to the highest bidder. The walls of Sandringham felt like they were closing in as the date for the emergency Privy Council session arrived. This was the royal tribunal Princess and had demanded, a last-ditch effort to settle the war behind closed doors before the monarchy collapsed under the weight of a public trial. But the atmosphere shifted from tense to electric when news broke that Harry had landed at a private airfield outside London under the cover of darkness. He wasn't there as a spectator. He was there because the letter Charles never sent had finally found its way to him, intercepted by a source that neither the king nor the queen consort could control. Inside the tribunal, the seating was a map of the royal fracture. Charles sat at the head, a man whose silence was now his only weapon, while Camilla sat opposite him, surrounded by a legal team prepared for scorched earth warfare. Princess and Prince William stood as the guardians of the institution, their faces set in grim masks of duty. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and the cold reality that by the end of this day, the House of Windsor would be changed forever. The proceedings began not with financial audits, but with the letter. When the contents were read aloud in that hallowed room, the words felt like a physical blow to everyone present. Charles's raw confession, his admission that the crown had become a wall between him and his son, stripped away the last of the royal mystique. It proved that the king's heart had never been in the legal war, but his hand had been forced by a shadow influence that had manipulated his grief for political gain. Camilla's defense was swift and merciless. Her lawyers didn't deny the shadow influence. They argued it was necessary because the king was incapacitated by his own emotional instability. They presented evidence of his private breakdowns and the erratic behavior that allegedly necessitated her taking control of the royal accounts. It was a calculated attempt to turn the king's own words of love into proof of his unfitness to rule. The queen consort was no longer fighting for a marriage. She was fighting for a regency that would leave her as the ultimate power behind a broken throne. But the room fell into a deathly silence when Harry was called to speak. For the first time in years, the brothers were in the same room, separated only by a table and a lifetime of betrayal. Harry didn't bring anger. He brought a final, devastating piece of evidence that a secret audit had missed. He held a copy of the amended codicil to Queen Elizabeth's will, along with a recording that suggested the questionable persuasion used on the late queen was more than just words. It was a threat. Harry's voice, steady and devoid of the usual media polish, echoed through the chamber. He revealed that the reason he had stayed away wasn't just about Meghan or the press. It was because he had been warned that his return would trigger the release of documents that would destroy his father's remaining years. The rejection he had faced was a shield meant to protect the king, but it had been twisted by the silent hand in the palace to look like a family feud. As the truth about the late queen's final wishes and the manipulation of the Cornwall Fund collided, the network of quiet consent among the courtiers began to crumble. High-ranking officials who had stayed silent for months began to look at Princess and, realizing that the survival of the crown now depended on a complete purging of the shadow influence. Charles looked at Harry, then at William, and for the first time in the entire crisis, he didn't look like a king under siege. He looked like a man ready to make his final stand. The recording played in the heavy silence of the Privy Council chamber, and for the first time in decades, the palace's polished facade didn't just crack. It shattered. The voice on the tape was cold, clinical, and unmistakably aimed at a dying queen, proving that the betrayal of Charles wasn't a recent development, but a long con executed while the monarchy was at its most vulnerable. Camilla's legal team, who only moments ago had been aggressive and defiant, sat in a stunned, paralyzed silence. The evidence of institutional treason was no longer a whisper in the hallways. It was an undeniable reality that stripped away the last of the queen consort's leverage. Charles stood up, and for the first time in this crisis, he didn't look like a man broken by illness or heartbreak. He looked like a monarch who had finally seen the silent hand that had been moving the chess pieces of his life for far too long. With a cold, decisive fury, he ordered the immediate dissolution of the Cornwall Fund and the stripping of every unauthorized patronage Camilla had established in the shadows. The shadow regency she had envisioned, the parallel power structure meant to secure her legacy, was dismantled in a matter of minutes by a king who had finally chosen the crown over his own silence. The letter Charles never sent was finally handed to Harry, not by a lawyer or a courier, but by the king himself. It wasn't an act of reconciliation meant for the cameras. It was a father reclaiming his son from a system that had used their rift as a weapon. As the brothers stood together, the rejection that had defined the last several years was exposed as a carefully managed narrative, a drama fueled by the shadow influence to keep the king isolated and the heirs divided. The unsent letter had become the bridge that rebuilt the House of Windsor in the middle of its own ruins. Princess Anne, the unbroken moral compass who had forced this reckoning, watched as the Privy Council began the process of a complete institutional purge. The network of quiet consent among the courtiers was broken, replaced by a new, cold standard of accountability that Charles had initiated in his final act of sovereignty. The soft abdication Charles had announced earlier was no longer a retreat of shame, but a strategic transition of strength, handing the day-to-day survival of the crown to William, and while he focused on the internal restoration of the family's integrity. Camilla's exit from the chamber was silent and unremarked. A queen who had gambled everything on a shadow throne and lost to the very tradition she tried to manipulate. The monarchy had survived, but the fairy tale was permanently dead, replaced by a modern institution that had finally learned that its greatest threat was never the press or the public, but the secrets it kept from itself. As Charles retreated to the quiet of Sandringham, the palace headlines finally changed from scandal to a haunting, necessary peace. The crown remains, but the truth is now its only currency.